Greetings everyone, it's Jeremy Sutton here from PrecisionPrinciple.com, coming to you once again from Makloganj, India on day 5 of the intensive Ashtanga yoga course. Now, today in the philosophical class, we dug straight back into Samkaya Philosophy. Now, if you remember, yesterday we talked about Samkaya and it signifies two different meanings. Number 1 is right knowledge, and number 2 is numbers. In particular, it means numbers because it has 25 parts that make up a human being, that make up everything. And so, yesterday we talked about the first main two, Purusha, which is pure consciousness, and Prakriti. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Now, these make up the fundamental aspects of the dualistic philosophy that is Samkaya philosophy. We have pure consciousness, Purusha, and the material universe, Prakriti. Today, we went a little bit further in to talk about some of the other 25 aspects. Now, if we think of this as a flowchart, we could think of consciousness starting it all, and that influences the material universe. Those two things are the foundations of everything. Continuing down from there, we start to get to the things that make us up in particular. And we have the intellect, known as buddhi. We have amkar, that's the ego. And then we have the mind. From the mind comes our senses. We have our actions. And then more fundamentally, the basics of things that make up everything, the elements. All right, so the important part of this today is considering the flow of information from whatever is out there into our mind, and what do we do with it? What do I mean? Let's consider a situation where there is an apple, all right? Well, how do we know about that apple? Well, we have our 5 senses. We have our sight. We might see that it's red. We could smell it. It smells like an apple. We could taste it. It tastes like an apple. But it really only has color, it has smell, and it has taste. Through our sensory perceptions, it goes into our mind. And the mind is where it combines those senses into one complete perception. So there's a flow here from our senses, individual pieces, to the mind where they're combined. And then that information is given up to, passes through the ego, which we'll talk more about the ego later, and then eventually up to the intellect, which is the center of the decision-making processes. So, Samkaya philosophy is also known as Indian psychology, in the sense that starting 2,000 years ago or more, they were already starting to try to figure out, what is the deal with the mind here? How do things work? What's the fundamental aspects of the mind, and what does that tell us about how we are and what we can do to live a good life, essentially. All philosophy seems to be trying to get to that question. How do we get the good life? And in Samkaya philosophy, in particular, we're talking about moksha, enlightenment, as the end goal for that good life. So what is this chain of perceptions? What does this have to do with anything, all right? So, the mind, the place where all those sensations come together to form a perception, plays a very integral role. It's a very strong nexus point in this whole system. The mind is a blessing and a curse following this philosophy. It's a blessing because we wouldn't really exist without it. Humans are not strong, we're not fast, we can't stand the cold, we can't swim all that well, at least compared to other animals. But what we can do is think. And in particular, we're pretty good at looking at the past, figuring out what happened, what went well, what didn't go so well. And we're good at the future, simulating the future. In fact, Richard Dawkins has made the argument that perhaps we evolved consciousness because of the benefits of simulating the future. That is, if we have to do trial and error, I wonder if it'll be okay if I jump off this balcony. Well, if I try it, I'm likely to die. And so people who tried it weren't likely to make it forward. Meanwhile, people who could simulate what might happen if I jumped off this balcony would probably think, it probably won't work out for me. And so the people who could simulate the future probably made it. And so he has argued that perhaps the evolution of our consciousness is a result of this ability to simulate the future, what's going to happen in the future. So it seems like pretty good, right? That's the blessing side of it. But there's then also the curse. Because if we're always dwelling on what happened to us previously, thinking about the past, or being worried about what's going to come up in the future, all of the time, our mind is taking us out of the present moment. Now this is very significant because the present is the only thing that actually exists. The past is gone, the future will never arrive, we can only live right now. So, the mind is the problem in this sense because it takes us out of the present. It takes us into other realities, and what we need to be is focusing on what we're doing right here. I mean, even if we're planning about the future, we should do it mindfully in the present, not just let our mind run away with these worries. And this right here, the fact that we habitually live outside of the present moment, is the fundamental problem that we're trying to confront. And as a result, yogic practices are designed to bring us back into the present moment. That is one of the fundamental aspects of what yoga is trying to do. So, another part of this is that it has been said that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. That is, because we live, we're going to experience things that are going to cause us pain from time to time. But suffering is more like the mental reaction to that pain. We can experience the sensations as they arise, something that hurts me, but it's that kind of contraction around that pain that is really the suffering side of it. So we will experience suffering, but we will experience pain, but suffering is optional. All right, so the flowchart goes from the senses to the mind to the ego. Now, what is the ego? The ego is probably one of the most important ideas to understand when it comes to psychology, personal development, philosophy, and the sort. And it plays a central role in the Samkaya philosophy. So what is the ego? I think it's called Amkar in this philosophy. Now, the ego is the part of us that always sees things from our perspective. It's the part of us that thinks I. It's the part of us that wants to do selfish things, wants to look out for our own best good, and isn't concerned with the necessarily other people's well-being. So this ego is a main problem because what it does is there's a vast universe out there, and in some sense we can say universe. There's only one universe. There's only one fundamental reality. It's all part of one thing. For example, if you were an alien and you came to the planet Earth, you would probably look at that Earth and say everything on that planet is part of that planet. You know, for example, you look at the moon, all the rocks on the moon are part of the moon. All of the rocks on the Earth are part of the Earth. The trees are part of the Earth. So we humans are part of the Earth. We're part of this thing. We grew out of this seed of the Earth. So in a fundamental way, there's only one thing. But the ego is what it does is it puts a boundary between itself and others. That is, everything inside of here is me, and everything outside of here is not me. So it creates this split between my sense of self, between who I am, what I think I am, and boom, everything else. So this split here between self and other is one of the fundamental, maybe the biggest obstacle in coming to self-realization. Remember, self-realization is one of the major obstacles, and self-realization has to do with identity. Do I identify with my mind and my body, or do I have a sense of I am something that's bigger than just this body, just this mind? And not only like an intellectual sense, as in, oh, I think I'm part of the universe, but actual felt feeling and experience of not being separate from all that is. So that's what we're talking about here. And so the ego is important because, yeah, it ultimately separates ourselves from everything else. So then the ego is basically filtering all the information that comes in. It goes from the senses to the mind, through the ego to the intellect. And the intellect is basically the place that can make the decisions. It's, in more modern psychological terms, it's just our memory storage. In the Samkaya philosophy, this intellect part of us is where the samskara are stored. What's samskara? That's the residual baggage that's built up whenever we have an experience. And following this tradition, it's that samskara that leads to karma, which leads to samskara, which leads to karma. And basically, if we collect samskara, that's the motor that keeps us in this process of birth and re-death and re-death, birth and re-death, if we're to actually believe this, take it literally. I think it doesn't need to be taken literally. The point is that these are the foundational ideas that that contribute to the reasons why we do these practices. And whether or not the birth and re-death is real or not real, the point is that enlightenment, some sense of awakening, of this dissolution of the boundary between self and other, is an experience that people actually have. And the practices of yoga do take us to that state of mind, whether or not the premises, this birth and re-death and karma and samskara, whether or not these are real. The process of reaching a higher state of awareness, a higher state of identification to something greater than ourselves, is certainly a real process. So the point is this, that once we get to the intellect, we get to the part of us that makes decisions. And we're starting to see kind of a division between what could be a higher self and a lower self. The egoic self is the lower self, and this tradition argues that there's kind of something beyond that that we can identify with, our higher self. Our intellect might be part of that higher self that makes decisions that connect us to something greater. Now, the intellect is the last thing right before the material universe, the prakriti, and the purusha, the pure consciousness. So we're getting back to the origins of everything right here. And this is kind of important. So it raises a very big question. What is reality? Is it real that I am this body and mind, that I'm identified with this mind, or is the pure consciousness real? Now, here's how this philosophical tradition deals with that problem. It defines reality as that which cannot change, that which does not change, because it's always perfect, it's always ever present, and it's always unchanging. So that's an easy answer. I'm sure there's circular logic in there, but the point is that following this definition of what is real, the only real thing is purusha, the pure consciousness, because that's ever present, unchanging. We talked about this more yesterday. But meanwhile, prakriti, the material universe, is always active. It's always changing. Our body is always on the move. Our mind is always on to something else. Next year, I won't be the same person that I am today. I'll have different thoughts, different feelings, different knowledges, different desires, different goals, and I'll be in a different place and time. So, but behind that, the pure consciousness, that part of us that is the same in all of us, the same thing that's the same in me, the same in you, the same in probably dogs and cats, this part of us, of the universe, is unchanging. So this philosophy argues that it's only the pure consciousness that's actually real. That is the most fundamentally real thing, following this philosophy. So the problem is that our day-to-day experience, it definitely doesn't feel like I'm pure consciousness. I mean, if I think, how do I feel right now? I feel like I am this body. I feel like I am this mind. I feel like I have hands, I have a name, I have thoughts, and I am this, and here's a notebook, and I am not that. I feel like that's different than me. So I imagine this is the same thing for you. You're probably looking at a computer right now, or a cell phone, or whatever, and you probably don't feel like you were the same thing as a cell phone. That is, you might say, I am here, and it is there. It is external to me. Therefore, most of us don't have a felt experience of being one with everything, of being identified with the ground of all being, according to this philosophy. So what's going on there? Well, if you'll remember a couple days back, we talked about everybody suffers. That's common to a number of philosophies. And the cause of that suffering is ignorance. So in our ignorance, it's argued that we identify with the body. because we have these experiences very regularly that make it seem like I am a body. So, therefore, I feel like I am the body. But this is ignorance. I think that's ignorance avida. So this avida keeps us separate from the actual truth. Now, part of these experiences, I don't feel like I'm identified with consciousness, because when I have an emotion, when I'm angry, I react. When I'm sad, I react. When I'm happy, whatever the emotion is, or I'm hungry, I feel these emotions and it sort of takes over. I identify with those emotions. I don't think necessarily that I have hunger, that I have depression, that I have happiness. Instead, I feel like I am happy. I am hunger. That is, hunger arises in me. And I don't feel like I have that. I feel like I am that. I identify with that feeling. Or in emotions, I am angry. The anger and me are the same thing. So if you consider psychology, especially I think it's Daniel Goleman, and emotional intelligence, this starts to sound a lot like emotional hijacking, where we have an emotion that comes through us, and basically I'm not in control anymore. My sense of self, my feeling of I is not in control, but this emotion is simply acting right through me, and it is in control of this vessel for a moment. So this is kind of the same principle. I identify with that emotion as it comes through, and it basically takes over. I am that thing, but it's sort of running the show. And so this is where we become a slave. We can become slaves to our emotions if we're not careful. If we are ignorant and we let those emotions take over, then we become their slave. They're no longer helping us survive like they do for all the other animals. They are actually controlling us to sort of do its bidding. The ego is sort of made of these emotions as well, and so we get angry and then we just want to lash out and do whatever that thing is. Well, now our emotions are causing us to do that ego's bidding. So the question is, what can we do about that? Because we feel emotions. I mean, nothing I do is going to stop me from feeling happy, sad, depressed, hungry, whatever, excited. So, how do we mitigate this? And funny enough, Samkaya and emotional intelligence, Daniel Goleman, both kind of have a similar answer. And it's one that goes through the ages. The answer is mindfulness. Mindfulness of the emotions as they arise. Because it's argued, if I am aware that I am angry as the anger arises, and I notice that I am angry and I just feel that feeling, then immediately it sort of takes the edge off. If I feel that anger and I think, oh, I'm angry right now, I can basically I increase my awareness instantly, and that increase in awareness helps me get back in the driver's seat. All right, now maybe that me is my ego at the moment, but we'll get past that later. So the takeaway is that mindfulness is one of the keys, maybe the key, because mindfulness in the present moment, is basically what we're going for. And mindfulness here can help mitigate the rise of the emotions so that I can kind of live up to my own highest standards to become my highest self. So, again, we identify with the body and the mind, and this is basically the biggest problem. For example, Alan Watts described this feeling of I, this ego, as the same feeling as when I clench my muscles, I feel like it's just held in tight. Well, when we do that psychologically, this contracted feeling in my head, that's the sense of self. That's the ego. And that contraction is not real, it's just a contraction. But if you let go of that contraction, the boundary dissolves. And when that boundary dissolves, you sort of melt into the ocean. Like I think it's Rumi who said, a drop in the ocean, or a whole ocean in the drop. As in, when you drop that drop in the ocean, there's no longer a boundary, a separation from that drop and the whole rest of the ocean. They are now completely the same thing. And the argument would be that that's how we are, humans are, and everything that exists is part of the same ocean, cosmic ocean, we might say. So the point is that the sense of self is an illusion. The sense of I is an illusion. And you don't have to take my word for that, but if you're interested to learn more about the self as an illusion and other people who think that this is true, I would recommend reading the Dalai Lama's book, Seeing Yourself as You Really Are, or Sam Harris's book, Waking Up, or Ken Wilber's book, No Boundary, or even Wahula Rapola. He wrote a book called What the Buddha Taught. Of course, it's a very similar philosophy. But all these pretty great thinkers have pointed to the same thing, that the self is an illusion, that if you go through the correct practices and you can dissolve this ignorance, then you can see that the self, this self-other border, is an illusion, and we can experience the moksha, the end goal of this path. And essentially, going to this, if I dissolve the boundary between myself and other, I might say that I am in a state of mind of no self. And that is basically the essence of a lot of meditation, or even the essence of flow states. If you read Csikszentmihalyi's book, he's a psychologist, Flow, or his book on creativity, you'll hear him talk about what happens to artists, athletes, business people, great leaders of all sorts. What happens how do they produce their greatest work? How do they how do these ideas come to them? Even Einstein mentioned something like this, where if you want to be involved with your passion, what you need to do is, or produce great work, what you need to do is find an activity where you lose yourself in the work, where you don't even recognize the passage of time anymore. Hours can go by when you look up because you were so engrossed in the activity itself, in the experience itself, that time disappeared. Your sense of self disappeared. These are glimpses of what this meditative practice is, this yoga practice is going for. And this is what is meant in that no self, or going beyond the mind, is the essence of meditation. That if you can sort of get into a flow state in a meditation, then that boundary between self and other is going to start to dissolve, and you're going to get a glimpse of what the moksha, enlightenment, is really all about. And so, we talk about ignorance and how ignorance is the cause of our feeling of self. So how do we start to go beyond that? Well, the Dalai Lama's book, Learn to See Yourself as You Really Are, has it's a great book because it's not only information, it's actually trying to lead you through an experience. It's actually trying to lead you through the specific experience of getting past this sense of self. I think it takes a lot of time and energy to follow the practices to really get the full experience that I'm sure the Dalai Lama lives, but he does have a great little exercise. And that, for example, we might say, look at your hand, right? And I might say, whose hand is that? And I might say, oh, that's my hand, right? Now, this already kind of raises a problem. It exerts the idea that I am a thing, that there's a thing that's I, and that thing that is I has a hand, right? And we start to really see it when we start to use our name. If I say, that's my hand, or I could say, my name is Jeremy, I might say, this is Jeremy's hand. It's like that there's a thing called Jeremy, and that thing called Jeremy has a hand, all right? So you can see that we start to create a separation between my identification with myself and my body. Now, I don't have to identify with my body. This could be me. I could say, yeah, this is me. But we tend to say, this is my hand. As in, that's not necessarily me. It's just something that I have. It's like, this is my notebook and this is my hand. And neither of them are necessarily myself. Now, sounds a little bit pedantic, but we can go one further. What about identification with the mind? Well, I might say, I have a name. My name is Jeremy. Again, we're starting to find that there's a thing that's an I, and that thing that's I has a name. They're not necessarily the same thing. They could be the same thing. That's a philosophical argument for a different time. But the point is that we don't have to be identified with the body. We don't have to be identified with our mind. I don't have to be my thoughts. I am angry. No. Maybe I have anger. All right? So we don't have to be identified with the mind. We don't have to be identified with the body. And so, the basic technique for starting to get past this ignorance is awareness. That is, we need to be aware of sensations as they arise. We need to be aware of emotions as they arise. And whenever we're aware of these emotions, these sensations, this brings me squarely into the present moment. And it's in this present moment that everything happens. So it's often said that, or it has been said at least, that yoga starts with awareness and it ends with pure consciousness. Now this could have two meanings. It could have at least two meanings. It could have a meaning in the general sense of a yoga practice. That is, oftentimes at the beginning of a practice you might chant Om, and that's, to sort of using the chant to focus your awareness on the present moment before you start the practice. And then through the arduous task, through the arduous exercise, as we immerse ourselves in this exercise, and it's difficult, and we just get into that flow state, and then by the end of it, we end in Shavasana, corpse pose. And if we've been doing this exercise for an hour and a half, and we've been in this flow state for an hour and a half, and all of a sudden we've exhausted the body, but we've been present throughout most of this experience, and we're laying there, then maybe we have a dissolution of ourself, that we just become the drop in the ocean. Our feeling of presence is pure consciousness. Maybe. And that is at least the experience that some people have. Whether it's everyone's experience or not is another story. So, what stops us from achieving this state of pure consciousness? Well, we said it's ignorance, but in particular, they say, it's argued, that there are 5 basic afflictions of the mind, and they are. I'll read them. Number 1, ignorance. Number 2, ego. Number 3, attachment. Number 4, aversion, that's the opposite of attachment, running away. And number 5, fear, and particularly, I think, fear of death. But a lot of these can be basically combined. What do I mean? When it comes down to it, there are basically 2 major afflictions. There's seeking pleasure, and there's avoiding pain. And this isn't only Eastern philosophical idea. Jeremy Bentham, about in the 1700s, I think, said that man is something along the lines of, man has 2 sovereign masters, pleasure and pain. And these govern everything we do. Even Tony Robbins uses these 2 things all the time when he's trying to get people to change behaviors. It's the carrot and the stick. You have to find something that you desire, that you want, that moves you forward, and then he would suggest that and Tim Ferriss also recommends the same thing. You need a carrot, a goal that you're going after, but then also kind of using that fear of the stick to keep you moving. Now these are very opposite philosophies, because Tim Ferriss and Tony Robbins are not doing anything to try to reach liberation or enlightenment. What they're trying to do is harness these natural drives, harness these natural tendencies, our desire to seek pleasure and our desire to run away from pain, and then ultimately use these to drive us as quickly as possible to whatever our goals are. But in here, we're saying that this attachment, this desire, craving to go towards something else, and this fear of something else are basically the principal obstacles that cause us to maintain this boundary between self and other. Because as long as we're seeking, so we're goal-oriented, going after something, we're thinking about a future state. Or as long as we're running away from something, again, we're thinking about the future pain. And maybe these ideas are based on our previous experiences. And so we remember in the past that we had this bad experience with this dog, and so now every time we see a dog, we're going to try to get away from it. Or remember that when we had this really delicious juice that it really quenched our thirst, and so in the future I have this goal to get this juice another time, or even a bigger scale, maybe I have a career or money and cars and drugs and women and whatever desires that people have out there. We get in our mind from past experiences, we see people on television, and all of a sudden we start moving towards some desired future state, or away from a potential future state. And essentially this worrying, these preoccupations, these afflictions of the mind keep us out of the present moment. And it's only in the present moment that we can enter into the pure state of consciousness. It's only in this present moment that we have the chance to be fully engaged, to reach enlightenment, to ultimately experience life to the fullest that we possibly can. So, that in a nutshell is what we talked about today. As you can probably see, it's getting late here. We've had 8.5 hours of class today, 3 hours of the actual asana class, and another couple hours of methodology, another couple hours of philosophy, another hour of pranayama, and another hour and a half or so of just note-taking. So I'm getting pretty tired here. It's about time to go to bed. But thank you very much for joining me. If you've made it this far, you are an all-star. So, in the meantime, keep learning, keep growing, and have a great day, guys.